right? Absolutely. Still a little checking up here in Portland. Okay. There we are. All right. Well, I'll turn it over to Chair Wise if you'd like to open the meeting, ma'am.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Let's start with a round of introductions. I'm Nancy Wise, Benton County Commissioner and LOAC Chair.
I'm Kirsten Green to Chair Wise's left. Thanks for being here today. Let's go to Councilor Bisco.
Good afternoon, everybody. Councilor Catherine Bisco, City of Philomath, and forgive my dog in advance who's trying to eat the FedEx delivery guy.
We'll see who wins. Let us know. Ingrid, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yes, Ingrid Cordell, DLCD Advisory Committee Coordinator.
Yay. And Mr. Gordon Howard?
I'm Gordon Howard. I'm the Community Services Division Manager for DLCD.
Thanks, Gordon, for joining. Let's go Sadie and then Ethan.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sadie Carney. I'm Communications Manager and a Policy Analyst at DLCD. And Kirsten, I did not realize that you are with Chair Wise in person in Portland.
Right. Is that
because
fancy?
there's the little virtual window. So hooray for in-person meetings. Very exciting.
Exactly. Thank you. And Miss Peggy Lynch. Oh, sorry, Ethan. Sorry, Peggy, one sec. Ethan, if you're on voice.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ethan Stuckmeyer, Senior Housing Planner at DLCD. Apologies for the camera. I'm having some issues. I might have to leave and rejoin, but happy to be here.
Then thank you. Thanks for pitch hitting for Sean today. And Ms. Peggy Lynch.
Wow, Mr. Gordon Howard and Miss Peggy Lynch. That's impressive.
Official.
Peggy Lynch, League of Women Voters of Oregon. Always interested to hear what the rest of the state has to say about land use.
Thank you. Joyce, I think that is our team here on the phone thus far.
All right, so on the agenda, we have updates listed. What updates do we have today?
Well, Councilor Bisco tried to get away from us, but we're not letting her. And I think that's one of our updates. I know that Commissioner Lindsay also could not join today. Vice Chair Vilastowski couldn't join today. And I would hope that Commissioner Willis would be able to join us. But Councilor Bisco, we'll talk about it today a little bit, but if you're willing to stay on with us until, kind of to and through recruitment, we'd be grateful.
So just to ensure that everybody is up to date on that comment or the context of that comment. So I did not retain my seat as a city councilor in the city of Philomath. So my last day as a councilor will be December 31st. I'm happy to fulfill any support or any role that I can in that interim, assuming that that's allowable. I didn't get into, after I sent that notice to you this morning, into Chair Weiss and Vice Chair Bielostowski. I did not take a look at the bylaws to see what was required or what was allowable, but I am definitely willing to support in any way I can and stay on as long as is appropriate.
We're grateful. Thank you. Yes, we checked with our Secretary of State because we knew your election was so close. So we were checking for you and for Commissioner Lindsay. Unfortunately, lost her election, I think, in the May primary, actually. But you're both welcome, and we really, really, really appreciate it. Both of you would be willing to kind of stay on with us as we recruit and empanel the next group. Our Secretary of State said that that's fine. Excuse me, our Department of Justice liaison, Steve Shipsey, said that was fine. As long as we're in the recruitment process. LOAC, a little bit different from the Citizen Involvement Advisory Committee. LOAC apparently does need to be seated elected officials, as opposed to with Citizen Involvement Advisory Committee, they can be sort of like in their region or in their role and then can leave their role. Same thing with LCDC. They could be elected when they take their role, but they don't have to stay elected. But LOAC, it does look like it has to stay elected throughout. So thanks for understanding, Councilor Bisco, and for your email this morning. I'm sorry I didn't proactively kind of let you know our strategy of begging you to stay on for a bit, but thank you for being willing. Grateful. Any updates from Benton County, Sheriff?
Nope, not at this time. Should we ask for other updates, questions, or should we move into recruitment?
I think are there any other updates? I think folks on the staff on the call are available to kind of chime in when their agenda comes. So I think that's really the big update would be the result of elections and what's going on there. So yeah, I think we're okay to move into recruitment. So, oh, and also I just would like to give regrets if I could from both our director, Brenda Bateman, and also Commissioner Jacobson, who through a scheduling mishap did not have this on her calendar. So we're both so sorry, but we've been looking at the calendar for next year, trying to get those all embedded on Commissioner Jacobson's calendar. I guess that is one more update. Commissioner Jacobson is stepping down from LCDC. So she will stay on with us through that recruitment through probably July. But we're actively recruiting for a new coastal rep. So a new coastal county representative on the Land Conservation and Development Commission. So if you have any friends in elected office on the coast, that position happens to be coastal and elected county representative. So it's kind of a unique niche that post fills. So on recruitment, we included kind of the form here that we used in 2021. It's down a bit in your packets because we had the meeting summaries. And if anyone has corrections on the summaries, please feel free to just send them to staff, to me or Ingrid. Ingrid, do you have the packet up, Ingrid?
I can share the application.
That'd be great.
Is that
Perfect.
all you need right now? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yep, that'd be great. I'm looking at it on my local computer, but I realized no one else could see it. So if folks had a chance to look at that in their packet, we can go over it just for a moment, but it's pretty straightforward. It has the purpose of LOAC and the intention to include elected officials from urban and rural cities and counties and reflect the geographic diversity of the state. It gives our purpose, goals and mission, and that the LCDC appoints members. Actually, we can update that, Ingrid. It's now 4-year terms. And committee members must be available for quarterly meetings and have sufficient times. And then you all can be getting your per diem allowances too, consistent with House Bill 2992 standards. And if anyone would like information about that from us, please let us know. We'll update the blurb at the bottom, which is recruitment being ongoing. Here, I think we want to talk today about the schedule. And then we can update when we would make recommendations to LCDC, whether it be for the January LCDC meeting or the April. And then Ingrid, if you could just scroll down, thanks. Yeah, so we asked some questions, and really this is up for, kind of always renewal, if there's anything that we want to be changing, but we always like to just lead with what motivates you to serve. And it's just a statement of sort of values and interests there. Population size gives us a chance to kind of make sure that we have small, medium, and large size communities representative. Describe any experience or interest in the statewide land use system, interest or experience creating more equitable outcomes for Oregon communities. And then some demographic questions, which are optional, covering race, ethnicity, gender, and whether or not folks that living with a disability, household income, and tenure of renting or owning. Those are standard questions we ask of all boards and commissions. And then what lived experience, skills, or knowledge would you expect to bring from LOAC? So that's the basic form, I guess Councilor Bisco and Chair Wise, is there anything that you would like to change or update about that basic form?
That's a good question. Might have to think on it for
Sure,
a
sure.
few minutes.
Sure, or weeks. You can look at, depending on what we decide today, you might have some time. So Councilor Bisco, do you have anything up off the top on the form itself? It's a web-based form.
So just generally, we're hitting the high points of trying to spread out representation. Are there nuances that could improve this application? Potentially, but we're also in that space where we're shifting not from 6, but to 10.
Yeah, 6 to 8.
Committee.
Six, yeah.
6 to 8, excuse me. I thought we went to 10. Okay, my apologies.
Well, they went, that was the range. You're remembering the outside range. So, but we decided to just go for 8 to kind of do baby step.
Okay. And so with that, how do we maximize that representation? And then always is that question, and it's not really in the application per se, but it would be on the administrative side for us, would be what happens if we don't have a good group of individuals to give us a diversity of representation. So those are kind of where my comments land more than specifics to this general document.
I think that's important. And so if we have a deficiency, kind of like what strategies could we do to hear from those populations or those interests or perspectives? Right. On the recruitment schedule, I'm tempted to pull up a calendar because I feel like I'm about to say a lot of words that are going to get tedious if we don't have something to look at. I'm not in my home computer. Let's just see if, although you don't necessarily want to look at my computer, but here at least we can see it kind of on the left-hand side. I'm just going to share this, even though it's going to be a little, it's not as, Ingrid, I'm going to share away from you just for a second. And show kind of a calendar where we have a choice here of whether or not to go to the January LCDC, kind of to recruit quickly and go to January LCDC, or to take a bit more time and go to April LCDC. And internally, our director Brenda and I kind of feel like let's take some more time. Our staff recommendations to take some more time and go out and wait to the April meeting. So the April meeting of LCDC is April 20th and 21st. So that packet would need to be done on April 6th. So we really still would be wrapping up in March, wrapping up the recruitment selection in March. Let's see. Sorry guys, I just went away from month view.
Well, can I add my 2 cents?
Please,
I
yes.
think having a little bit more time is good. That'll give us an opportunity to hopefully get more people, reach out to more people and get more interested people.
Good. I mean, Councilor Bisco, do you want to weigh in on that?
I definitely support that. I was just trying to do the math in my head. If we were to turn around, recruit, get actual applications, a window of opportunity to be completed by interested individuals, get them back to us, make recommendations and plan for a packet in January, that's a pretty steep lift, especially over holiday season.
Yeah.
So I think I would be more inclined to go with that April. And I'll just, here's, another thought that comes out or kind of stems off of this is this group was looking at how do we communicate with our local officials? What does that look like for this recruitment? And is there a way to send this to all elected officials, both county and city within the state? I know that's a small minor ask, but that might be the first step in how we do communication from LOAC just generally. This might be a perfect opportunity to wade into that with this particular application process, but I definitely would move towards that April meeting, not in January.
Great. guys, thank you. That's a big relief. I think to go out in January, we would pretty much need to put out the application tomorrow, and have it open to just probably like January 17th. So a very, very short window. And with new folks getting sworn in, that's consistent with how, if I may speak in their absence, Ariel and Michael with LOC and AOC respectively feel that that's probably the better call too, is to just take more time and allow that recruitment. So, okay, well, we'll develop an updated form for your review, and I think we can just email it to all LOAC members for consideration, just a one kind of document review. We'll put you on blank copies, so if you're responding, it won't be in quorum.
Perfect.
But that way you can kind of take another look and see. That is great. And then, yes, Councilor Briscoe, I think working with LOC and AOC to send it out to each elected official, and they might have those lists even better after, swearing in week, that first week and two in January. So allowing it to go out in January, and I would say stay open the entirety of February if we could, just fill up a couple pushes on it, and then meet as LOAC actually in March. So we had it's later on the packet. We had, if we can, Chairwise, is it possible to jump agenda a little bit?
Sure.
And talk about our next meeting dates? I think we have it at the end on the agenda, but Ingrid had sort of been putting out, okay, what if we meet in, I think our dates were February, actually it's on the agenda as well. So we're meeting, if we were to meet in 2023, in February to advise the April Commission, in May to advise the July Commission, in September to advise the November Commission, and then in December to advise the January Commission. What do we think if we could meet in March instead, so then we could look at the applications and make recommendations for the April? I think then, because we don't really have too much other business in February, so just let that be recruitment and push month, and then we'll have our meeting in March if that sounds okay.
Thoughts on that? Oh, but I see Sadie has her hand up.
Sadie hand, yeah.
Thanks, Chair Wise, and thank you, Kirsten. Just a few comments on the recruitment, because we are in the middle of a recruitment for the Citizen Involvement Advisory Committee. It just closed today, and we'll be bringing our recommendation to the commission for the January meeting. But we made a few modifications to our application, Kirsten, related to what may be available in terms of information through a public records request, and what we intended to withhold from meeting materials. And it has impacted sort of the run of our CIAC meeting. So in order to not have to publish the demographics information in the general packet for all of the public to see, as a means of encouraging people to complete that information, we are evaluating the applications in an executive session. And it just kind of changes the flow of the meeting. So I just wanted to flag that for the group as something that we're doing for your consideration.
Sure, thanks. That makes sense. That makes sense. So our March meeting might say have the first hour would be an executive session. And then did you have our DOJ with you on that, Sadie? In your executive session?
In what regard? He declined to comment on that because it's not an area in which he specializes. So I reached out to a different group at the Department of Justice, and they advised me through, several references to, I think the public, what's the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act.
Right.
And then I had a couple different meetings with them to kind of sort through how we could do it and what language we should include in our application. And I'm happy to share that language with this group so that you can replicate it in your application online.
Great. Yeah, Sadie, thank you. I'm not sure when you found time to do all that, but thank you. So Ingrid has on the screen some proposed dates for 2023. We're recommending March 13th, which is these are all second Mondays like today. So if those work, we could publish those and start to get those on folks' calendars. Have we sent this out to full LOAC? Yeah, I guess no, not these dates specifically. So this is a proposal, and we can certainly do a poll and call each member and see if March 13th, May 8th, September 11th, and December 11th work for folks.
Sure.
Okay, good.
I mean, it is always hard, looking so far ahead. It's like, oh yeah, my calendar's blank that month, but I do fill in. But yeah, so getting those nailed down sooner than later is good.
Great. And your board doesn't meet on Monday?
Correct.
Yeah,
Tuesdays.
perfect. Okie doke. Well, good. Okay, I think that was 2 agenda items in one, Chairwise.
All right. So are we good with recruitment? I mean, we're agreed that we are moving to the extended timeline. Okay, that's great. Very good. So next up, it looks like Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, executive summary. Yes. I have Sean listed. Who do we have here?
We have Ethan. Sean got pulled over to that meeting across the street.
Okay.
So Ethan, if you don't mind giving us an update, kind of where this is in its time, space continuum, and anything you'd like to point out on the executive summary.
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Ethan Stuckmeyer. I'm the senior housing planner at DLCD. I have some slides, but I think I will just pull those up for the purposes of visual aids, but I'm not going to do any kind of like formal presentation because I think that probably is a little bit, unnecessary here in terms of going through all of the nitty gritty, which I'm happy to answer any questions on just kind of generally. So I'm here today to talk about the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis and the process that DLCD and OHCS has engaged on, really since the beginning or the end of 2019 to think through a reframing or an update or a tweak to the way that the state of Oregon plans for housing in terms of the needed housing in the local governments and basically what you do if you have a need for housing, how you plan for that housing, the land use decisions you make, and how the existing system isn't quite working the way that we think it should. So I'll kind of begin through this process here. Please stop me if you have questions. I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got, and we'll kind of go from there. So we're sitting here in December of 2022 at the end of a 3-year stretch of work, kind of directed by the legislature. That started in 2019 with the passage of House Bill 2003, which was a test case, a prototype of something called a regional housing needs analysis. So the context that's important here is local governments today typically do a localized housing needs analysis where they estimate their 20-year housing need within their urban growth boundaries. The regional housing needs analysis process
Sorry,
is
Ethan, just a point of clarification. Those are cities, right? Are the bodies required to do a 20-year supply? Okay, thank you.
That's right. Yep. So within an urban growth boundary, cities do those analyses. The regional housing needs analysis is actually a program that the state of California has implemented for several years at this point. And that is a way to regionalize, of course, that housing need and then allocate that or distribute that housing need at a regional level down to the local governments for them to then make planning decisions on. That process in the state of Oregon was kind of a test case under House Bill 2003. This Oregon Housing Community Services Department was tasked with running that methodology. And then DLCD's role in that process was to take a look at that program, that analysis, and say, could this work for Oregon? Could we adapt the California model to Oregon? Are there pros, are there cons to that process? And kind of the short response to those questions were, yeah, we do think that there are some significant advantages of going through a regional housing needs analysis program that are better than the outcomes that we have today or we've seen over the past 50 years of the land use planning system or housing planning system. So in the 2021 session, the legislature followed that direction up by saying, okay, what are those actual recommendations? You've done the prototype analysis. How would you make this work? Like, what are the statutory changes? What are the actual policy changes that need to take place to actually implement that into the state and local planning program? So we've in the late 2021, we began a series of work group meetings with one work group at the time to begin talking about that process. And very quickly, what we learned is that whenever you're talking about housing, whenever you're talking about land use, the UGB always comes up very, very quickly. And so in that process, we kind of went back to the legislature in the 2022 short session and said, hey, the conversation here is really shifting to the urban growth boundary. There are implications on if we change the calculation of housing need into how you translate that into land capacity and the amount of land that's available to put housing on in the urban growth boundary. So the legislature directed DLCD to think through some of those and enter into another work group process to kind of think through those regional housing needs and land supply issues head on and directly and incorporate those into the recommendations. The recommendations process, again, sitting here on the 12th of December, we're very, very close to actually submitting that final report to the legislature. I believe it's actually finished and it's just kind of going through the final reviews and getting sent off. So that should happen very, very soon here. So let's talk about all the conversations that we've had that led us to this point. So of course we had the legislative direction, but we had all sorts of conversations with folks across the state to think through when we think about housing planning, we think about housing need, what kind of things do we feel like is necessary in that program to update it to make it work better. And through the course of a series of focus groups, regional forums, one-on-one conversations with folks who are interested in this topic, going to conferences, having conversations there, three major themes arose in the course of all of those conversations. Those are partnership, accountability, and investment. In order to do any kind of reform to the housing planning program, these three things need to be these are critical to those reforms. So kind of when we're talking about partnership, local governments have had kind of the burden of planning for housing in the state for the entirety of the land use planning system and have received some support from their regional and county and state partners. But when we talked to those folks, they said, you know what, we should actually we feel like we need a little bit more support and partnership from our partners in this process. And so kind of the key here in partnership is that county, regional, state partners should play a role in planning for housing going forward. That kind of rolls into the accountability process. What happens when we're planning for housing and we're not meeting kind of the goals of the program? We're not meeting the outcomes that we would hope to achieve. What happens then? And then investment. Without a doubt, without a doubt, investment was the number one request for in the conversations that we've had with folks, especially around things like infrastructure, site preparation, development readiness, and having resiliency in our communities and how we plan for housing. Those kind of investments take place across the state in various agencies, but there is a lack, I would say, of coordination of those investments and a lack of general flexibility on how those investments can be made and the strings attached to those investments. So definitely a need for more flexible funding in that regard is what we've heard. So let's talk a little bit here about the old Goal 10 planning process, kind of describe how that's led to the outcomes that we received today or that we see today and how those could be changed, that process could be changed to actually achieve some better outcomes. So Goal 10 is the housing statewide planning goal. The concept and the intent and the spirit of Goal 10 is very simple. In fact, it's on the screen here: to provide for housing needs of citizens of the state. Very simple, but of course has huge implications. And how you go about that process in the state of Oregon is defined through a series of kind of planning documents. And on the bottom of the screen here, you've got this diagram that kind of describes how the Goal 10 planning process works today. Kind of 3 steps: Oregon population forecast. What is your growth projected in the city? The housing capacity analysis is basically an analysis of the existing land that you've got within your urban growth boundary to meet that future housing need. And then the housing production strategy is basically the suite of tools, actions, and policies that you'll actually implement to achieve your housing need over the 20-year period, whether that's land use or other strategies. And so that process has kind of really been, the outcomes that are achieved in that process are a little bit disconnected, we think, from the intent and spirit of Goal 10, provide for the housing needs of folks in the state of Oregon. The housing capacity analysis and the Goal 10 process that exists, I think, really laser focuses in on the efficiency of the land within, and the capacity of that land within an urban growth boundary. And that looks at a really small, narrow scope of the entirety or the spectrum of all of the things that need to take place in order to go from bare land to a housing unit to house a household. The capacity of that land is but a small part of that long process of transferring that land into housing. And so if we're just focusing on that, we lose, to some extent, a focus on all of the other aspects of the land use planning system that result in housing. So kind of the result of this process of being so focused in on that land capacity exercise is resulting in kind of that underinvestment and of housing, and really an underproduction of housing to meet our true needs.
You said we kind of skipped the numbers at the beginning. What numbers do you guys talk about when you talk about underproduction? Where are we now?
Oh yeah, good question. So yeah, I could have included that in the overview, but that kind of prototype analysis that OHCS conducted back in 2020 and 2021 found that over the course of the next 20 years, the state of Oregon will have to produce, in order to meet its need, 580,000 units to accommodate that 20-year need. And within that 580,000, 110 units are currently non-existent. There's an underproduction of housing. We're behind the 8 ball in terms of providing those housing for the people who need housing right now today. In addition to that 110,000, there's an estimated 30,000 units that are needed for people experiencing homelessness. So a total of 140,000 units kind of behind as we sit today. So that's the kind of underproduction estimate.
Thank you, Ethan.
Yes. All right.
So Ethan,
So,
if I
yeah,
might
please.
ask a quick question. So just to clarify, we're looking at 580,000 units over the next 20 years, but we're adding 140,000 on top of that to give us 720,000 basically is that long range plan.
No, sorry. That 140 is or that 150, sorry, that 580,000 is inclusive of the 140. Yeah.
Super, thank you.
Yes. Any other questions?
And I think for LOAC, you've heard a bit of an overview on this before as it's been moving through. It's a major body of work. I call it kind of a 180 of how we do housing planning in Oregon. Like it's a major overhaul. It's big in Governor Kotek's kind of transition thinking. And we heard her priorities today. You've seen them in the press. So, LOAC's always thinking, Ethan, of like, how do they advise LCDC? And LCDC doesn't have a policy item on this right now because it's done. It was actually a staff level. It wasn't a commission rule or anything. So it actually happened at the staff level. But any kind of questions and insights you guys have for Ethan today will help just, I think, hopefully your own understanding as we get ready for what is likely to come out of the legislative session. So this is all sort of still background. But any questions or comments you have from either a county perspective or a city perspective as we go forward will be instructive. Thank you. Thanks, Ethan.
Absolutely.
Please, Chair Wise has comments.
I have a question just for my own understanding.
Mhm.
So Before as a commissioner, I was a city councilor for the city of Corvallis, which is the biggest incorporated area in Benton County. And as a councilor, I was on the council while they were doing the buildable lands inventory. And so I'm just curious, how is this process different? How does it change that process of doing a buildable lands inventory that larger cities have already been doing?
Really, really good question. And one of the key pieces in the suite of recommendations, there's actually 8 of them, and I'll get to them in just a moment, are one of those key pieces is how the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis would change only one piece of the way that local governments go about planning for housing, and that is the allocation of housing need to those local governments. So allocating that housing need about what is the city's needed housing over the next 20 years, what kind of things should they be planning for, is the only change in terms of the numbers or the calculation that cities would that would change the process. The response to that housing need is still the local government's decision, and they're in the driver's seat in that process. It just changes basically that kind of starting point that cities find themselves at.
So it changes how the amount of needed housing is calculated?
Right,
Yes.
the demand as opposed to the supply, where it's like you're
Okay.
the buildable lands inventory.
Yeah.
You said like, okay, we can supply so much. Is that, I could be using
That was
overly simplistic, old thinking, Ethan, but go
Yeah.
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna skip that slide that we were just on and kind of just jump right into this because I think it'll give some context. So there's 3 basic recommendations, and there's kind of 8 sub recommendations in the report that will be submitted to the legislature. The first 4, recommendation 1, are all of the things related to land use and how cities plan for housing. So these are kind of the things that are within local government, regional government, and DLCD's control and from a land use planning perspective. Recommendation 2 and 3 are more about coordination, more about funding, more about what are the kind of long-term policy goals of the state and how's that kind of play into the local planning process. So let's kind of dive into recommendation 1 here. So there's 4 on the screen, but a little bit more detail here. So recommendation 1.1 would be formalize the owner process, right? Very simple, straightforward recommendation. That process is what I was just describing, Chair Weiss, about the state would estimate housing need for the entire state and within regions, and then allocate that housing need based on things like the underproduction of housing for people experiencing homelessness. It would incorporate elements of the impacts of second and vacation homes into that estimation of housing need, allocate that down to local governments, and then the process by which cities would complete the rest of their Goal 10 planning process would still be pretty close to the way that it has happened in the past in terms of doing a buildable lands inventory, conducting something like a housing capacity analysis, determining the capacity of their land, and then going through and making decisions on the unique and contextualized housing production strategies that they would like to implement to meet that housing need. So all of those kind of local decisions are still paramount in this process. Does that help clarify?
Yes. One other question, and I guess it's about the when. When would a city be triggered to go through this process?
Right, good question. So House Bill 2003 and from 2019 actually put cities with a population above 10,000 on a schedule for completing their housing capacity analysis and a housing production strategy. For cities outside the Portland metro, that's once every 8 years. And cities of that size are kind of already on this schedule. It kind of ranges from this year all the way, until 2028, I believe. All of the cities have been placed on that schedule. That's based on when they've completed their most recent housing capacity analysis.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, it kind of rolls on that cycle. But then one of the, I think, great things about the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis is because it's a methodology that's produced at the state level, that methodology can be running constantly. And annually, we can provide an estimation of housing need not necessarily for planning purposes, but to track the progress that we're making as a state, as we're making as a region, and as we're making as an individual local government towards those kind of lofty 20-year housing production goals. So while that housing, the ONA, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, those numbers are constantly being crunched, there's only a snapshot in time that the city is taking that information and making planning decisions based on that information. And then that can kind of change as we go through something like a housing production strategy, where it's more dynamic, it's more responsive to the actual needs of the community rather than being a snapshot in time. Does that help?
Yes.
Describe, yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that, like going back to Corvallis as an example, that, 4 years later, they're not having to redo all the work that was such a heavy lift.
Yes, right. Yeah, and I think part of this process, and I'm off track here, but I think that's okay for the purposes of this conversation. Part of, I think, the benefit of an Oregon Housing Needs Analysis and the state playing that role is that the process by which cities make those decisions on the local policy implementation, that process becomes, because just solely due to the fact that the state is providing the numbers and then the city is making decisions based on on those numbers, it becomes less litigious and less legally open and vulnerable to challenge, so that cities can kind of get out of the analysis part and get into the action part, making decisions that are responsive to their housing need. And I think there is a lot of interest, and I think a lot of excitement from folks that we've talked to that are really excited to kind of get out of that analysis part and just focus on policy making. All right. And yeah,
I see
please.
Catherine's hand.
Thank you. I think it was Commissioner Weiss that acknowledged, there was talk over there for a moment. Just a couple comments in, first, I'm hearing a couple different mixed languages, but overall what I'm hearing is relatively attractive when we look at the benefit of the state really managing that analysis piece. I know for our city, we just went through a housing needs analysis in the last couple of years, and the process from start to finish was significant. And when I consider how much time was spent in that space, we're a city of about 5,800 versus if we had spent that time somewhere else in efforts working with our Citizen Involvement Advisory Committee, our Planning Commission, and our city councils. There's definitely a benefit and efficiency that I'm hearing in what your recommendations are proposing here. I like the idea that we're looking at annual updates, being able to track that progress. I wonder though, if you could go back to the slide right before, the old goal 10 is what you called the slide. There was some language in there that when I was reading it and how I was feeling about it, might trigger some of those feelings and kind of gut reactions about the home rule. The home rule ownership that really has, I think sometimes our cities appropriately have taken that view of that home rule responsibility. And sometimes I think it becomes just a burden and a barrier just that's assumed when we look at state involvement. So my question is just to the language of under accountability, you have local solutions with guidance, direction, and support. I'm wondering if there's a set of words that might lean away from what could be interpreted as interfering with home rule. And it really is just kind of a gut reaction when I read it. I've got a whole group of folks that I know in local government that I know that's how they're going to read it. And I don't really know that that's the intent of what you're proposing here. I really do like what I'm hearing. So making sure that home rule, in fact, is emphasized and ensured in this process while we have the state come on board and help build that efficiency and that partnership, I think will be key in how you present this and could make the difference between more resistance and less. So it's just a comment. The other one is I was curious more on if you have more, you could expound on the regional collaboration. So it sounds like we'd have a state housing needs analysis and we'd have state numbers that would trickle down into region then down into city, if I heard you
Mhm.
correctly. Would there be other regional collaboration happening in this space? Maybe we haven't got to that yet, but it is a question that I have.
Yeah, Commissioner, I'm gonna shield your eyes here. I'm gonna scroll back down through these slides here. So, sorry, was gonna jump. No, okay. So I just want to comment on your first comment. I appreciate that, and I think the intent of this process is, like you say, not to say that the state is going to get involved in those processes. Rather, the state is participating and partnering with local governments in that process by allocating funding, providing support, regionalizing, and kind of opening up those processes into something that the state can really assist in, rather than kind of like dictate down to or mandate down to local governments. So yeah, I take that. I take your point, and I think it's a really good one, and I'll definitely talk to the team about tweaking some of that language as we go forward.
May I ask the counselor which what was of the words was sort of triggering for you vis-a-vis local decision making? Sorry,
I don't know. I don't know that it was any one specific.
Okay.
But just knowing what the fallout, not
Mhm.
all, but enough of the fallout from House Bill 2001 and 2003. There was a lot of, there still are a lot of hard feelings about that. And so when I look at local solutions, which means we get to decide how to build with state guidance, I think direction was the word, and support, and even guidance. So we could have interpreted House Bill 2001 and 03 as guidance that wasn't necessarily appreciated. So is there a way just to capture that essence of assurances along the lines of home rule and that local solutions, maybe emphasize that more with perhaps the word, I think Ethan said it's a partnership, and get another word, but I didn't get it written down. Being involved in that process rather than any space where the state is mandating and dictating. And in fact, Ethan did use those two words specifically. I just think that we need to be maybe overcompensating coming out of the experiences that were had with House Bill 2001 and 2003.
And Chair Weiss is coming.
Oh, yeah, no, that's great, Catherine. I'm glad that you brought this up. And for me, when I heard funding, that really, I'm like, oh, good. That's, that makes it better.
It's almost imperative, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, for sure.
It is,
And we will
yeah.
have home rule. Sorry, when you're done, Ethan, I'll just make a note about home rule.
No, please, Kirsten, go for it.
So I'm no expert in Councilor Briscoe and Chair Wise. I think, it's sensitive, right? The sort of social contract that is our balance of state land use planning goals and then local governments. And we all acknowledge that, the best planning is local, you know what I mean? Because people know their communities. Not today, I won't be on the spot, Gordon, or maybe he's ready to chime in. But Gordon will kind of, if you're okay with it, we'll have in now March, we'll have a little kind of overview of the history of home rule in Oregon. And I know you guys get those briefings at commissions and councils, but from the purposes of statewide land use planning, Gordon will bring some information. Vice Chair brought it up last time. Could we have a 2023 agenda item on home rule? So we are kind of preparing that in the back end, and Gordon has presented to our policy team internally about kind of the myths and facts about home rule in Oregon. And it's sort of like an elephant where everyone kind of feels it differently,
Yeah.
But it'll be a really important conversation. Please, Gordon.
Yeah, I wasn't going to get into home rule, the details of that, because that's a much larger topic. But I was just going to say, I think the way I see the intent of this program is to have local governments be given targets for what their housing that they need to provide, but then give local governments a lot of tools and options for how to achieve those targets. In other words, if there's a target for a certain amount of affordable housing in a community, that affordable housing could come in many different forms. It could be, for sale ownership product. It could be a rental apartment product. It could be a manufactured home park. It could be accessory dwelling units. I think the idea is that that local governments, once they have kind of, what they're not going to be, have the flexibility to do is determine how much housing they need, because that's, an issue of overriding statewide importance, but how local governments provide that housing or work to provide that housing, that's another point. I think the system is set up that not the local governments have to guarantee. It's like, the way I would say it, it's like when you have kids in school, you don't tell them you have to get an A, you tell them you have to try to get an A. And I think that, with local governments, it's to work to provide the housing. They obviously can't guarantee it's going to be provided, but to do their best and have a lot of different options for doing that. And I think that's the way the ONA program is really set up to give local governments a lot of flexibility in finding the best way that's consistent with local needs and systems to meet a statewide housing goal. So I guess that's a little long-winded, but that's kind of my thought on it in terms of the issue of being too directive versus or prescriptive rather than giving local governments a lot of options in order to achieve their fair share, if you will, of the state housing goal.
Yeah, Gordon, that's a good point. And recommendation 1.2 here speaks to kind of that target setting. And these are targets, first, the process that we have today does not include any tracking towards progress of housing. How are we doing towards meeting our housing needs? There doesn't really exist a good program in today's paradigm that would track that progress. The ONA program would change that through tracking that progress over time, not to measure how cities are doing in terms of the actual number of units, because we know cities aren't the producers of housing, and that's up to all sorts of complex factors that determine the production of that housing. However, tracking that progress is important to kind of pair with the actions that the cities are taking towards achieving the production of that housing and the outcomes that are defined in the ONA program as important outcomes. The process that I think is really important in there is that we've spent a lot of money as a state on doing the housing planning, doing things like housing capacity analysis, doing things like buildable lands inventory, but a lot less on funding the implementation of those actual policies. And so I think this kind of sets that process up in a way that you can actually fund some of those implementation of some of those things rather than just continuing to plan to do those things over time. But Sadie.
Yes, I love it. Thank you.
And Sadie, did you have a comment on that note as well?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, Chairwise, and others. Just by way of example, one of the things that in the past DLCD has worked to relieve some of the technical burden from local planning staff is working with PSU, Portland State University, and providing consistent grant funds to that group to provide population forecasts. And that was something that was frequently, as Ethan was mentioning earlier, a contentious and litigious matter as cities were trying to grow. And so I think what we're looking at as a model is something kind of like that, where Portland State University is providing these statewide population forecasts. We would have kind of a similar sort of statewide provision of housing need in this regard as a way of kind of relieving that technical burden and taking away some of the opportunities for litigation that really slow things down. So just wanted to share that example in case it was relevant to folks or sort of helped people see a parallel.
Thank you.
How are we doing
All
on
right.
time?
We're doing okay. So honestly, this discussion could go, another 15, 20 minutes if needed. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. So before we shift into recommendation 2 and 3, I want to touch on this last one here, recommendation 1.4. This is where that additional legislative direction on the UGB lives. So within this sub-recommendation, there's a series of even more sub-recommendations. I think another 9 sub-recommendations under this process to describe how the urban growth boundary amendment process and the way of calculating the need to expand or amend an urban growth boundary can be streamlined. And so that process, we know, is one of the most, if not the most litigious of all of the processes in this entire statewide planning program. And so kind of thinking through what are the ways where we can make that either less litigious, more straightforward, more objective, and more getting towards a more well-planned expansions rather than things that are like large bites at the apple, which we've seen over the course of the recent decades, where cities are kind of going for all at once rather than smaller, more well-planned out expansions, which just makes the process smoother and less time and resource expensive. So I'm going to move into, yeah, please.
I just want to express my support for that. Benton County just worked with the city of Adair Village to expand their urban growth boundary. And that was a legislative process. And, you know, if there were other commissioners on the Board of Commissioners, it could have gone a different way. I mean, there's a lot of wiggle room in there to, I guess, have your opinion one way or the other and ways to justify what's needed and not needed. So I think this is excellent.
Okay. And Chair Weiss has spoken to the need for partnership as well with cities and counties, and that's just a perfect example where it's like inextricably linked based on that expansion. Yeah.
It really is. Yeah. And there are ways we've seen through surveys and conversations with local governments, both elected officials and staff, that there are ways to make that process much quicker and less of a hassle in terms of the back and forth and that kind of tug of war between stakeholders, and kind of raising those up, things like urban reserve planning, which bring the timeline of an urban growth boundary expansion from years to months, when you've kind of pre-planned out that urbanization of your community. And those kind of things are really important. We should allow those opportunities more and more in that planning process. So yeah, I think it's a great example. All right, moving into recommendation 2 here. And this is really about kind of that funding piece. Recommendation 2.1 is saying fund the housing market where it wouldn't be produced, where housing wouldn't be produced on its own. So OHCS, Oregon Housing Community Services, has funding to build housing for people who need it the most. This is a recommendation to continue that, but add to that. This is not a recommendation that is in direct conflict with the great work that OHCS is doing. We should be building housing for the people who need it the most. In addition to that, there's also opportunities for the state to fund housing where construction is either really close, or the feasibility of that development is either really close, or could be there with a relatively small amount of investment or subsidy from the state. So things like workforce housing, things like middle housing, housing in rural and coastal contexts and markets. Those are kind of things that would really move the needle in terms of addressing our housing need, but kind of fall outside of the scope of the existing programs that the state of Oregon has in place today. So coordinating that funding, bringing that together, and funding some of those additional pieces, I think is really important in addressing something like a 580,000 unit need over the course of the next 20 years. Major investment is needed in addition to what we're already making. Any questions on that piece? Yeah, Commissioner Bisco.
Of course. So my first question in this is, as we enter this next legislative session, every agency is asking for more funding in every capacity, in every way that they can. Speaking of a major investment here, and there's no doubt that this will be, what mechanisms are being proposed or recommended, or do we already have those identified to where these funds will come from to support some pretty substantial funding?
Right, it's a great question. And I think we've got a portion of it thought through, but the rest is, I think the extent of this ask to fully fund a housing market is absolutely immense, right? and the number is massive. But there are investments that the state is already making in things like infrastructure funding at Business Oregon and at ODOT and at DEQ and at OHCS that could be refocused and using some of that existing investment to refocus that towards housing production. There's also other opportunities thanks to the federal government investments that we could as a state leverage to really put that magnifying glass on the production of housing, something like the infrastructure IIJA Act that recently passed at the Congress, and bringing those funding opportunities into the state, leveraging those for things like development readiness, so on and so forth. In addition to that, there also is potentially some new money that needs to be brought into the picture, things like and those would be, I think, really any of those new investments that would really be focused in on development readiness, especially. So things like a system development charge buyback program from the state would be something that I think is of interest of folks. The other is a tax increment financing mechanism that either has a reoccurring kind of re-upping of funds or a one-time kind of loan program that's paid back at a low interest rate that's enticing to cities and incentivizes them to utilize that program. So, but I don't think, to your question, that gets to the full extent of the need, Commissioner Bisco, but I think it gets us part of the way there.
Thank you, Ethan. That's helpful. I'm going to wonder how you're going to wrestle all that money back from Business Oregon and ODOT, but let's go ahead and give it a shot.
I think even at Business Oregon at ODOT, they recognize the extent of the housing crisis that we have in the state. And I think there's a good opportunity to have those funds focused in a way that would benefit both their core mission, but also the mission of the state to address a 580,000 unit shortage or need over the 20-year period.
You said that beautifully. I think you're correct. There's possibility there. Thank you.
And then recommendation 2.2 here is about putting housing choice for all paramount in that state policy, in state policy. There's some work that's been done through the housing production strategy, things like House Bill 2001 and other things that cities can do to recognize housing choice for all as a state policy goal. But I think that still leaves something to be desired in terms of making those strategies intentional to increase the accessibility and the opportunity for housing for folks, and not just planning for one segment of that housing need that cities have over the next 20 years. And so kind of this recommendation would say, hey, let's make that a state policy goal and put it in either statute or have some sort of legislative direction to that effect. So recommendation number 3 here, the final one, and I think this one potentially has the greatest potential impact, maybe outside of the funding investments. But like I mentioned at the beginning, local governments have been the ones to say, look, we need to be participating as a state in that system and coordinate our efforts so that we aren't spending money at Business Oregon on infrastructure that doesn't respond to the housing need, or making investments at ODOT that don't respond or create additional barriers to the production of housing, or thinking through things at DLCD that we can do to unstick the development issues that property owners and builders find themselves up against. So kind of coordinating that through some sort of state agency or cabinet or council or other mechanism so that we can quickly move through those issues and intervene and mitigate against those barriers as they come up. And then the final one here is Commissioner Bisco.
So just a question on this one with that housing production team kind of model. When I hear what you're saying in the narrative that surrounds what's in text here, what I hear is something that is akin to like the regional solutions team, only geared a little bit more towards housing production. Am I following and tracking kind of in a similar direction?
Yeah, I think when we think about how this could function, there isn't a really good model that exists today. So Regional Solutions lives in the governor's office. That process in and of itself has pros. I mean, they work in breaking down those barriers, finding solutions. But I think there are also cons to that process, that the constantly moving, shifting set of folks. It's hard to keep that in a long-term setting. It changes based on the priorities of the administration. Those kind of things, lend itself to maybe not being the right fit. There's also, other opportunities to put that, creating a new state agency is really, really politically difficult and expensive, and maybe even not the right solution. Having something like a council could be good in terms of bringing all the agency directors together. But even then, they don't have the authority of a governor that would, find those solutions in a quick manner. So there's just not a super great model that we can use. But I think there are steps of blending some of those elements into some sort of entity that would coordinate those state agencies. So
That's
kind of a series of trade-offs.
Yep, that's appreciated and helpful. Also, I'm curious, because this is a recommendation going to the legislature, do we have a dollar amount attached to this particular recommendation? Do we have a target amount of individuals for this first round, the first cohort, or the first team? Staffing is expensive, as is the longevity of a program, something like this. So do you have a target in mind that you're going to recommend when you bring this forward?
We don't. So those decisions so the DLCD recommendation would be to coordinate or create an interim mechanism, whether at an existing state agency or creating a new state agency, because implementing that, I think, over the long term would require a lot of shifting power and dynamics in the existing state agency program. So we're kind of proposing this interim group of folks at an existing agency so that they can be that housing production team. But I think where the legislature is going is more of a kind of council, agency council approach. And any of those kind of decisions would be made by the legislature in terms of what the staffing looks like, who are the convening agencies, who's at the table. So I don't have a great answer for you there.
It was a good answer.
All right. And then the final recommendation here, 3.2, is we ask cities, local governments, especially those over 10,000, to identify their game plan to achieve their housing production over their housing production target over the next 20 years. That's a lot of work and requires cities to be acting in good faith towards meeting those housing production targets. And what this recommendation is saying is that the state should do something like that as well. They should be identifying the things that only the state has authority to do to increase housing production or juice production, unstick development. And the state should clearly identify those, put those policies down on a piece of paper and actively try to achieve those over the course of legislative session or biennium or whatever the case may be. And same with Metro. Metro should also be doing some sort of long range planning, thinking through all the things that are within their scope and authority to do to actually meet those regional housing targets. And so both of these are saying, hey, cities, you do this, we're also going to do this. We feel a sense of responsibility and accountability and partnership in this. And so we are also going to set forward that plan of action and that game plan. So those are all, that's the suite of the ONA recommendations. I'm happy to answer more questions, have more discussion about what all that means, what are the next steps, where we go from here. Happy to be responsive to whatever you all feel like is necessary in terms of conversation.
Thanks, Ethan. Chairwise, did you want to maybe, Peggy put the bill in the chat. Should we touch on that?
Sorry,
Ethan,
I didn't look at the chat.
Is it an agency bill, or is that someone is that another?
Oh, yes.
version?
Okay. Yep. This is Legislative Concept 1917. And this is the ONA policy bill that's coming out of the House Housing Committee and Chair Maxine Dexter. This would basically implement all of the recommendation 1 pieces of the ONA that we talked about, all of those things within DLCD, local government control, and actually implement the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Program in the state. And I think it's pretty long. I think it's something like 80 pages. Is that right? That doesn't sound right. Is it?
88.
Yeah, 88 pages. Yeah. So there's a lot in there. It requires a lot of changes. If it were to be implemented, it would require a lot of fine tuning and tweaking of existing statute to kind of wedge that process into the state and local planning system. There's just some things that if you go about it from a state level wouldn't work at the local level any longer. And so you would need to either pull those out or make them work within that system. And those are all kind of the statutory changes. The elements that are more, I think, technical in nature would all be decided over the course of the next biennium through things like a rulemaking process where we would, as DLCD staff, have all sorts of stakeholders at the table and try to work through some of those issues about how does this actually work at the local level? What does it mean to do housing capacity analysis without a localized regional localized housing need calculation? All of those nitty-gritty pieces would be determined if the legislature were to move forward with these recommendations and adopt them in this session.
Troy, can I offer something? So the LOAC would like to, so Ethan, this LOAC wasn't rekindled when you were taking up House Bill 2001-2003 rulemaking,
Right.
but they are now, we're back. So
Great.
if you could make sure when that happens, if we could run, kind of try and bring the charge and the representative interest to and through LOAC, that way they could have an advice, because their role is advisory to LCDC on matters affecting local government. So it'd be wonderful to in our process to build and bring in that draft charge and the draft representation by LOAC prior.
Absolutely.
And if special meeting is needed, that I could see that. What did we just agree on our schedule, Ingrid? Was it July for, no, was it, when is our fall meeting?
September.
So is it September?
11th.
Yeah. Okay, that probably works because that would be advisory to the November LCDC, Ethan, so if you had a draft charge, even early draft charge and representation to bring through, that'd be great. And that kind of a parallel thought is the Citizen Involvement Advisory Committee used to kind of have a seat on any rulemaking advisory committee that they would drop on or off, if people were available to volunteer to do that. I would think it might be nice to have a similar link with LOAC so that if a member from LOAC is willing to actually sit on, this is going to be so major, sit right on the rulemaking advisory body. So we're sort of advising real time and then meeting as LOAC in between, to give guidance, but see if we can recruit one of the new members to sit on that. Could help with just communication flow.
Yeah, I think that sounds absolutely fantastic.
Great. Any other questions for Ethan? It's a lot to metabolize. It's a major body of work.
Catherine, did you have a question?
If we've got enough flexibility to add another question, I just looking at the overarching of this process and knowing some of the concerns that are likely to come from local government, city specific, is with housing also comes a need and a requirement for infrastructure, and infrastructure continues to put pressures on our cities already. What mechanisms or what conversations are you having? And you may not even necessarily have answers. I'm just going to throw this to you so that you can consider this. That will be a topic when we look at the state saying, hey, you thought you only had to build this many, but we're behind by 580,000. And now you need to build this many more in that period of time that you were originally planning, X, for example. So that infrastructure build out while we are restoring and updating older infrastructure. And again, this is not a narrative just for my region. This is kind of all over the state that we're hearing that. I think that will be a question in this space somewhere. The other question I would have is when we look at the state if the mechanism is to have a state number in mind that filters down through regional and then to state specific. I know that in the South Willamette Valley, both sides, east and west of the I-5 corridor, there are restraints because of wetland areas to where there isn't the ability necessarily to expand housing. There are issues, so Sotaville comes to mind, who doesn't, their water capacity is none, right? So there's issues with that. I know on the west side here, we have areas that are flush with water and we have other cities that are not so much. So with the realities of environmental constraints, how do you have proposals on how you're going to filter down the assigned number of additional housing units based on the realities of where your city might lie within the valley or within, the regions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think the allocation process by itself wouldn't take those things into account. The allocation methodology would take things like population growth, the job share, transportation sheds, those kind of things, regionalized housing markets into account into that allocation. And remember, the allocation is for the purposes of tracking, but not for any kind of like punitive measure, but for the purposes of informing the local decisions. And so I think as we are allocating those things to local governments, those decisions on, look, we've got this wetland issue that is really constraining our ability to meet that housing need. And what are the strategies that we can employ either to, in spite of those constraints, or to remedy those constraints? And that really plays into the state partnership, I think, when we're having conversations as a state about what are the things that we can do to actually achieve our housing production over that 20-year period and longer. And the state producing its own housing production strategy. Those are the kind of conversations that we can have at a state level about, what's DSL right now has a wetlands plan or has recommendations on how to address some of those issues in the South Willamette Valley. But right now it's kind of just sitting on the shelf. And one of the recommendations in that that housing production strategy at the state level is to actually act on some of those recommendations. Another element of that state housing production strategy is working with building codes to ensure that we're right sizing and kind of fitting those building codes in balancing health and life safety, but also, removing those barriers to housing production that have been identified by builders. So those are the kind of really broad state level policy things that I think we as a state can set forward in terms of, hey, we will be addressing these, but those local government decisions can only be made based on the existing system that they're operating within. So it's on the state to kind of find the room where we're able to allow those cities to make the decisions that they feel like are right for them.
So Ethan, if you can just deliver all that content along with that conversation about home rule, I think you've got a home run here.
Great.
I think really addressing those questions, not controversies necessarily, but those questions and really affirming what the role is, what the plan is, how we're going to work around some of these scenarios will go a long ways towards making motion forward with us. So looking forward to next steps here.
Yeah, thank you. Ethan, do the over 100 tools on how